Today's Grow Echo Didactic is being provided by Sylvia Pla-Raith, MA, and Ms. Pla-Raith is the Director for the Elder Justice Unit in the Consumer Protection Section of the Office of Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. Sylvia has over 30 years of experience working in the interest of older victims. As of November 2015, she served as the lead staff of the Attorney General's Elder Abuse Commission and the Director of the Elder Abuse Unit. Prior to joining the Attorney General's office, she served as the Chief Supervisor for Adult Protective Services in Cuyahoga County. In addition, Sylvia serves as the chairperson for the Ohio Coalition of Adult Protective Services. Her vast experience includes hands-on elder abuse investigation, training, advocacy, and policy development. Ms. Pla-Raith holds a Master's of Arts degree in Health and Human Services from John Carroll University and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from The Ohio State University. Our case presenter for today will be Lori Warren, Court Investigator for Summit County Probate Court. And before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Please mute yourself during the presentation. To communicate with the group, use the chat function and share all chats with the entire group. If you are on the phone, use *6 to mute and unmute. And please make sure your name shows on the screen as well as your face. We're building community here, and being able to put a name with a face, it helps all of us. During the case presentation, you can unmute to participate in the discussion if you wish. Just so you are aware, today's session is being recorded. Also be aware that the details of the case have been changed to ensure patient privacy. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Sylvia Pla-Raith to begin the didactic portion of our echo today. Thank you.
Margie, thank you for that very kind introduction. You made me sound, I sounded old. I'm gonna have to change that 30 years of experience to something that doesn't sound so old.
You can just go with a vast array of experience.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
So I was asked today to present a little bit about and talk about neglect. And we're gonna approach it from a couple different ways. So I'm gonna, from my own experiences using adult protective services, but I'm also, since I've been with the Attorney General's office, I've been learning more and more about criminal investigation. So I'm going to present it in a couple of different ways for you to look at. So we're going to just skip the objectives, but obviously I'm hoping after today we'll go over some of the common elements of what is neglect, how does it present. But I'm also going to include from a criminal perspective what's considered criminal neglect. So as a reminder, in Ohio, we recognize 6 different types of abuse. And so today we're going to focus on neglect. But I want you to keep in mind that in order, these allegations don't happen by themselves. They typically occur in combination with other allegations. Like, for instance, for me to be neglectful, oftentimes I'm using tactics that could be considered emotional because I could be threatening the individual, or I could be using some physical elements. So it's not uncommon for us to see multiple forms of allegation of maltreatment. I wanted to start off with a tricky question for all of you, and maybe you could use your chat box, but does the Adult Protective Service definition of neglect, does it include common types of intentional and unintentional forms of elder neglect? So do you think this statement is either true or false? That in APS, it includes both intentional and unintentional forms of neglect? Denise, I don't know if you can keep an eye on the chat for me and tell me if people are responding. You're muted.
Sorry, there are a number of folks responding true. It looks like for the most part, everybody is saying true.
Which is good. So I'm speaking to the choir. The reason this is an important question is a lot of folks think that neglect only occurs when the person intended to do that. And that affects how they interview the caregivers. If they feel a caregiver, for instance, sometimes they say things like, I was doing my best. And we really need to, when we're looking at neglect, we really do need to look at what the outcome is. And we're going to talk more about that. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to, typically neglect is when is a form of non-action. So there's something's needed, it's not being happening. But in order for us to declare a neglect, we really need to have information from the caregiver. So that this person intended to be the caregiver, or did we assign them that position? I don't know how many times I've heard people will say something like the daughter's being neglectful, and it turns out that she never wanted to be the caregiver, even if they live together. So sometimes we make assumptions about that relationship that we really do need to ask more questions about, because maybe they don't want it, and forcing them to do it or asking them to do it is not a good idea. Or there's other resources available, which we'll talk about. So in Ohio, we've actually recently updated. So in 2019, so it's recent in the sense that because APS in Ohio, the law went into effect in the 80s. So in 2015 and 2018, we've had several changes to the definitions in Ohio and the jurisdiction. So we added, which I think is interesting, in Ohio, the definition of neglect includes three things. So it's focusing on the failure of a person to provide for the goods or services that are necessary to avoid physical harm, mental anguish, or mental illness. So the word failure is important. So in APS, we use the word caretaker. I know that the average person uses the word caregiver. So we're going to review with you the definition of caretaker, but it's basically someone who is taking on the responsibility of providing care. They don't have to live together. It doesn't even matter how much care they provide. It's the fact that they are in that position of providing care. We added abandonment, which is really important, and we're going to explain it more too, because in the past, before 2018, if I assumed care of my mother and I didn't want to take care of her, and I just stopped, and some of you may know situations like this where they're overwhelmed, they had enough, and they just stopped, and now there's been no provisions made for the care, that now is considered abandonment. So it existed for children's services, but we did not recognize in Ohio that if someone had taken on that care and decided to leave, that it wasn't necessarily a neglect. And now we're saying, yes, it's a form of neglect and it's actually abandonment. So here's the first definition is the desertion of an adult by a caretaker without having made provisions for the care. So in these cases, we want to focus on what kind of care is needed, because typically that determines how fast, how urgent is the need to ask to respond for adult protective services. Like for instance, if someone needs 24-hour care, they're bedbound, and their caregiver leaves, that's going to generate an emergency for adult protective services, or they're going to respond that day. So it's real important that when when we're trying to figure out who's providing the care, but what care is being provided, because we're really trying to figure out how to replace that care and what risks are there to the individual without that care. So if someone, a 24-hour caregiver leaves, that's probably going to mean that's going to make a big risk versus someone who's getting intermittent assistance that we can come up with a plan. And we'll have questions at the end, because I'm usually like to ask and stop, but I thought we would just go through all of this. So this is how Ohio defines what a caretaker is. And a couple of things so we talked about the person assuming the primary responsibilities, but it's important that it's just not family members. It could be anyone. And it could be on a voluntary basis. So if a neighbor is taking on this responsibility, a family member, so it could be someone who's not being paid, even by contract. So technically, and this is important because when we're making referrals to adult protective services, if the caregiver is a professional, it could still qualify technically for a referral to be screened in. So it's important to look at the relationship. Do they know each other? How did they meet? How did they come to meet? Are they getting paid? Are they not getting paid? And then of course, if it's ordered by court, those are the different ways that someone can come in contact to be the caretaker. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's not just family. This is a code, and I don't know if some of you heard me when I was chatting before we started. So for adult protective services, that's civil. There's actually a criminal code, and this is important. This is because a lot of folks think that neglect can't be charged criminally, and there is a criminal code. It's not just for older adults, it's for any functionally impaired person. So it's basically, the criminal code is failing to provide for a functionally impaired person. What we look for in this case, and I had actually a few of these when I was in Cuyahoga County as a chief supervisor, you have to prove that the person is actually a caretaker in court beyond a reasonable doubt. So, and that could be challenging because typically when someone gets caught in this situation, the first thing they're going to do is to deny that they were the caretaker. They're going to say something like, "I was just helping out. I was doing my best." And I know one famous case that I had, we were able to prove they were a caretaker because there was documents like healthcare power of attorney that indicated who was taking responsibility for making decisions. We had a lot of witnesses that heard the person say at the hospital, that he was the son she never had and he was providing care. So we had to come up with a lot of ways to prove that he was in fact the caretaker. The knowingly to provide is hard to prove because you have to show and demonstrate that they were taught to, they assumed the care, so they went to a care plan meeting, they assumed the responsibility, they were taught how to do it, and all of a sudden they didn't do it. So there's ways that you have to prove in the court that they knew they were failing, to provide that care. Functional impairment is basically same thing. We're looking for medical records. We're trying to define in court that this person had a impairment, whether it's dementia, cognitive decline, whether they're physically impaired. So that's what we're looking for there. And then, of course, we're looking for what services are needed. So this is where care plans and discharge planning and things like that are very important and critical because they could show and demonstrate what was the care that was needed. And this can actually be a felony. And I'm just pointing out, so the case I had, I remember it actually went to court, and Michael was actually charged and faced time in jail. It was ruled a homicide, and because this person actually died, but they were able to prove that it happened over many, many years of neglect and the care she didn't receive. So it's not as common, but I think it's because we don't always recognize it and we think of neglect as a civil thing. So these are things what we just talked about. It's just your slide that has a definition of what the law considers someone who might be functionally impaired. And actually, I'm sorry, that's a repeat. We did do that one. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The other neglect, this is for nursing home residents where failure to provide for care in a facility. So this definition is, so failure, the one I just talked about can happen in any location. For people in facilities, patient neglect, there can be a criminal code as well for gross neglect. So as we talk about the victims, and it's important, the majority of them are females. I think in our last statistics I looked at Ohio, 60% of older victims are female, 40% are male. So I know it can be either one, but statistically, the reason we still believe women are more statistically likely to become a victim of elder exploitation, elder neglect, is because they typically live longer and some of the resources are used up with their spouses. So they are actually more vulnerable economically, as well as more vulnerable to being neglected or even self-neglecting. So in terms of signs and symptoms, and I know these are hard because especially if someone has medical conditions and sometimes it's hard to discern, is this a result of a medical condition, or are they a result of neglect? I actually have a case consult that I had this week that someone called me about where the guy's on hospice. And some people are thinking his wife is neglecting him. And so I was actually talking to them about, because he was in the hospital, he was admitted for a decubitus ulcer that had become infected. And I know this is common when someone's bedbound because busy being turning off and some other stuff. But I said to the APS, I said, you're gonna have a hard time here because some of the things that are occurring could occur even under the best of care. So for us to really figure out whether this is from neglect, we're going to need to find out more about, who's coming into the house, who's providing care, who's not providing care. She's not turning him, and I'm having a hard time understanding. She actually has the bed up against the wall. So I'm like, why is she not turning her husband? And if that's something that's supposed to happen, we're going to need to find out more about how can we get her to move the bed, or does he need an air mattress? I mean, we can't just leave it alone saying, well, there's not enough room, I can't turn him. We're going to need to look and to see if she's actually neglecting him, to find out what kind of evidence is there. They're having a hard time with the medical, with getting the evidence, because again, a lot of the things that are happening to the husband could also be explained because of his condition. He has advanced dementia and he's not able to move. He's becoming contracted. So I think that's going to be a hard case to prove a failure to provide for a functionally impaired adult because of what's going on. So what motivates people to neglect? What motivates people? And there's really two main reasons. It's a lot of it's for money. So neglect, for those of you, a lot of times neglect and financial abuse go hand in hand. Like the case I was telling you about where we proved Michael actually basically wanted to inherit. He was all about money. He manipulated Elizabeth to the point where he had access to all her money. So she was actually an epileptic, and he stopped giving her her medication for seizures. So she was having seizures, and it's like, yeah, he was wanting her to be confused and debilitated, because while she was confused and debilitated, it would make it easier for him to access the money. So many times in these cases, the neglect cases are motivated by money. The other big thing that we look at is the power and control wheel. It's an issue of how who's controlling who and who's benefiting. And a lot of these situations, and this is where we used to think, when I was a young APS worker, we used to think that the main reason caregivers took advantage or neglected their loved one was because they were stressed out, and caregiver stress, which we're going to talk about it. So we still recognize caregiver stress as a complication, but it's not what we actually found out from working with our colleagues in domestic violence is that we have many perpetrators who actually want to intentionally control the situation. So they want you, they're going to manipulate you into thinking I'm burned out, and I'm going to get you to focus on me, and you're going to feel sorry for me. So you're not really paying attention to my actions and how it's affecting my victim. So they're very manipulative individuals, and they can use all of these power and control mechanisms are designed to control the situation. So caregiving and caregiving stress is a real thing, but it's not an automatic direct line. We know lots of caregivers who provide a lot of care who do not commit abuse. So it's not automatic. What we do know we need to pay attention to is their relationship. So what kind of relationship do they have to begin with? If they had because sometimes, if it was strained in any way, like a red flag for you are cases of domestic violence is a good example. Sometimes they switch of who's the abuser and who's the victim. And sometimes you'll see where they will alternate who's abusing and who's actually being the victim in some of these cases as they get older. So it's real important when we're working with individuals is to look at the relationship. How's it stressed? I used to tell my workers when they were workers that let's offer them services, because if she's telling me she's stressed out, let's offer her services to alleviate the stress. If she accepts the services, we're going to feel that, we're going to alleviate the allegation. That's a good thing. If they don't accept services, that's when we start recognizing that's actually an intentional situation, is when you're offering them services and they're refusing them. That's usually a red flag that we need to do more digging, because they really don't want it to stop. They want the situation to stay very much the same. So I was taught, bad guys, they lie a lot, they manipulate. A lot of times they're very charming with you, so we don't even have any sense or clue that they're actually not abusive. And I know I myself probably was tricked when before I became a chief of APS. I spent the first 20 years of my career working as a mandated reporter, as a case manager. And I'm sure I myself was tricked and deceived into listening to the individual, making excuses and justifying their behaviors. And things like I was doing the best I can was a big red flag that at the time I didn't realize that. So when someone told me that, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. I gave up my job to do this. And those are ways that they say things to you that help manipulate and to keep you to identify with them and distract you from looking at the victim. So in any neglect case, when we're working with folks, it's really important to identify who is the caregiver, to talk to them and to find out what services, did they want to do? Was it something that they were pushed into or that they feel obligated, to get a sense of what kind of services they're doing? Because the other thing we want to pay attention to is the perception of care. It's not how much time they provide care. It's how do they perceive the time that they're spending? So if, again, you've probably had cases where someone provided 24-hour care and they had good coping mechanisms and didn't feel a sense of duty or abuse, but it's really, I've had people that maybe had to go over there one day a week to do something that for them that was stressful. So it's their perception of the care they're providing that we need to pay attention to. It's not how much care they're providing, if that makes sense. And then, of course, we want to pay attention to what's happening to the victim. So because of the lack of services, how's that impacting? What kind of risk is this person dealing with? Are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. And don't assume, like I said, I used to make assumptions about family members all the time. Just because they live together doesn't necessarily make them a caregiver. And so it's important to have those conversations. So in terms of who do you work with, who do you collaborate? So typically in the community, these cases could end up making a referral to Adult Protective Services. We might need to make referrals to law enforcement or to other medical providers. I remember one case I had we were all blaming the spouse that he was being neglectful to his wife. And it was interesting because what we found out in doing some digging once the case became an APS when we were investigating, we found out that the spouse was actually adjudicated. His daughter was his guardian. So we were expecting him to take care of his wife. And here it turns out that he couldn't even take care of himself, but somehow because they were married, no one did enough conversations to realize that he wasn't going to be able to take care of her, of his spouse. So the bad guy or the perpetrator in that case was actually the daughter, who was knowingly letting her father, who she was his guardian, to be the primary caregiver of the spouse who was terminally ill. So it's really a crazy case. In that case, we ended up the APS. We worked with APS. We worked with a hospice program, and we also had to figure out we had to find out to have the husband evaluated to really find out what he could and couldn't do. These cases can happen in any location. So the providers, if it's in a facility, it's going to be different because in Ohio, Adult Protective Services doesn't have the authority to investigate cases in facilities. So we would have to turn to the long-term care ombudsman or the health department. So if the bad guy is a family member, you could still refer to the Department of Health, as well as I always put a pinch in for the Attorney General's office. Medicaid fraud unit has the authority to investigate any case. They have original jurisdiction on. That's the only section in my office that doesn't have to be invited in. Medicaid fraud unit has the authority to investigate any type of financial or patient abuse in a Medicare facility. So it's important because people get harmed, whether it's intentional or not. All of you got that question, and it makes me happy because I've had people think that just because someone didn't mean to do it, it wasn't neglect or abuse. And I'm like, the reason they did it, if it's intentional, it's going to be harder to prove. If it's unintentional, basically you provide services and they respond, and you can alleviate the abuse. So reframing the situation, as we talked about, we want to make sure that, you know, as I mentioned, everybody experiences stress, but not everybody abuses. The perpetrators in these situations oftentimes will just target the victim and not others, and that's why it's sometimes harder for other people to see it, because they don't treat you that way. Typically, these cases are not isolated. It's a pattern of behavior, so you have to study over a course of time. And then the last one is just a reminder that we don't, you know, sometimes we'll tolerate this with kid. We don't tolerate this behavior with adults and with children and pets, but somehow we do tolerate it when it's adults. So I want to see if there's any questions. These are some resources for you from my office, the Department of Aging, that has this information that I think is helpful if you need it. I'm going to leave a bit of time for questions before we jump into the case. So Dan, I don't know if you want to unmic, or do you have them use the chat box? Denise?
I can do either. I don't see.
Hi. Hi, this is Patty Thorborough. You know, you talk about that elder abuse can be intentional or unintentional. It's kind of like a slippery slope, because how can you, if somebody's doing the best they can and they are found to be not doing what they're supposed to do, because, you know, there's a lot of things we talk about, the, you know, daily activities of living and things of that nature. You know, how can one as a caretaker know that they're not being neglectful? That's my question.
It is a hard one. It is hard to discern, and that's why I said you have to have conversations and try to figure out, first of all, so if the person tells you they're doing the best they can, that could tell. So in the next step, we really need to figure out what are the consequences. So, and can we tolerate them? Because, so I've had patients that are maybe not in a perfect situation, but the consequences, we can tolerate the outcome. So it's really paying attention to two things, and why we would call it abuse is we would really need to look at not just the action or non-action, but what are the consequences. So the one I just told you, this person can't turn her husband, and he has bed sores, and we all know bed sores can become septic, and, you know, he's bedbound. So can we tolerate, can we tolerate her telling us that she can't turn him every 2 hours? Or should we be focused on, now he has bed sores and he's going to need to have, you know, he was hospitalized already just recently because of them. And maybe she shouldn't, maybe we need to step in just because she wants him at home. Why does she want it at home? Because let's think about it. If he's at home, first of all, why isn't she paying for more services? Because if she can't turn him, is there an alternative? Can they hire an additional care? Because right now there is no other care. Or do we need to say, okay, medical, sometimes we turn to the medical field to determine maybe this person needs 24/7 and he's not getting it. And so the alternative is it's not safe for her he needs to be in a different setting that can meet his needs. So she may not be hurting him on purpose, but it's the fact that she can't provide the care and isn't substituting it with and supplementing it would be, let's focus on what he needs and how do we get him to get that care. I don't know if that helps you, but
Well, you know, I'm a caretaker, caregiver, whatever you want to call it, for somebody who has Huntington's disease. And I am totally cognizant and I'm fortunate to have people around me that have resources, but I feel for this woman, because if her husband is supposed to be helping her and she's supposed to, you know, help, I mean, it's really hard to navigate the resources that are available to you. How would one give this person help to do that?
so you can get so right now there's a couple agencies were involved and they're no longer. So I worked for 20 years. I worked for the Western Reserve Area and Agency. I'm a big fan of having people evaluated. So the first step, and I always say that to people, you know, you can get a community-based assessment. So the first thing is, let's find out what care is needed. And then from there, what care is needed, not assume it, but let's assume we get a professional, give us an idea of, do they meet level of care or the intermediate? Do they have skilled services? But to get a sense of what services are needed, and then are they available? Because when I was an APS chief, not everybody went to a nursing home. They needed 24/7. You know, we had a care plan meeting and we came up with a way to get the plan, the services in place. So I think for her, the first step is, has that happened? So have we had that care plan meeting? Are the services available? I'm being told that she has been told about the services, how to access them. She's not letting them come in. So, and I'm sorry, I will admit that I'm a little skewed in my, I was telling someone, I've heard a lot of bad stories in my day. And so I'm probably more cynical than most of you, but I know there's a lot of bad people out there, and I know people are motivated by money. I'm probably more skewed now that after being at the Attorney General's office than I was before. But for a red flag for caregivers is really having those conversations, because have they been educated about the resources or about the disease, and have they told how to get resources? Because you can get private services, Medicare services. You know, how are we going to get those services in, and do they exist or not? And this is where it's different from one location to the other. I wouldn't label someone neglectful until I've had an opportunity to offer them all those resources and try to facilitate the linkage. I wouldn't label them neglectful until I've done all that, and now they're not doing it. I gave them all the resources and they're not doing it. That's when I would start looking at, I think there's something going on here. So
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
and I was a caregiver too, by the way, of my parents. And I can appreciate how difficult it is. I was probably a better APS chief at the end of my 10 years, because I actually was a caregiver. And so I knew firsthand, you can be a really dynamite caregiver and advocate and making all the right calls and still be not where you want to be with care. And I wouldn't label that person neglectful. The people that are neglectful are folks that the resources are available and they're refusing them. Thank you. And thank you for being a caregiver.
We have a comment from Kay Warapa. Do you want to unmute and share your comment? Or would you like me to share it? So she shared that she wants to refer to a case involving senior living memory care community and a resident to the long-term care ombudsman.
Mhm.
The ombudsman notified the facility of the pending investigation and planned to visit the facility 1 week before the visit. As a result, the senior living facility removed evidence of the neglect abuse and changed their behaviors and staff prior to the visit. How can we avoid such experiences and get evidence to support a case and facilitate change?
And I'm assuming that happened, facility investigations have really been affected by COVID. So I don't know if this is did this happen recently or a while ago? But I do know that, residents really have suffered quite a bit in the facilities during this COVID, because there's been a lot of folks are not going into the facilities. So they're trapped many folks were trapped in facilities with their perpetrators because of it was a staff. So I think so in a situation like that, first of all, I work for the Elder Justice Unit. We get a lot of calls from some people who are trying to figure out what would be the best authority to call. So is it the ombudsman, is it the health department, or should we call the Attorney General's healthcare fraud section? They all do different things, but they work together all the time. So the ombudsman is the most common that we're most familiar with. And the ombudsman, we're not making too many home visits. They only recently started to go back into the facility. So a lot of their investigations, when we called them, they were basically trying to do the investigation by phone. So I think residents were at a disadvantage. I do know that the health department will go up. So usually I call all three, to be honest with you. When I have someone in a facility, I typically notify the ombudsman as well as the Department of Health. because they regulate the place, they license the place, they regulate the staff. So are they providing enough supervision? Sometimes I can get them to look at records, and if they see something, they can't tell me, but I know that they'll contact our healthcare fraud section if they feel that an investigation should be launched. In the situation you said, the ombudsman's not supposed to do that. The ombudsman, I'm not aware of the ombudsman having a policy that they call ahead to say we're coming out. So I'm not aware of that. Typically they go out to see the consumer, what their job is to go out to talk to the resident to see what is their take on what's going on. And sometimes the resident is aware that they're being taken advantage of and a victim, and sometimes they're not. And that's why the ombudsman is a little bit more challenging for them to investigate a concern when the older adult doesn't know they are being victimized, which is why I end up calling the health department, because they regulate the facility and the staff. So they have enough supervision, and they typically, the health department will look at the records, not interview anyone, but do the records, kind of like, did they document it and that kind of stuff. And thirdly, the healthcare fraud section can actually do an investigation, whether it's patient abuse, medications. There's lots of reasons why you might want to use it, but because we only have a few minutes, I would encourage you either to call me offline, and maybe it's not too late for that particular case to make a referral to the health department. I think it can go back a whole year. So here it says a question. Sylvia, you were speaking about the manipulation of behaviors versus caregiver stress. Was this a research study that was done? I'm intrigued by this thought. So the research was done initially in the early stages of APS. That was the only research that was conducted. We thought people who were abusive were stressed out caregivers. We've learned through our working with our partners that work in domestic violence and are more familiar with perpetrator tactics and how perpetrators control their victims. We've really learned more about there are people who want to control their victim by using these tactics. I don't have one particular research in hand, but I can probably find out more and probably send it to Denise if this group is more interested. And Denise is telling you all that my slides, she's going to send this out to you. Plus I gave her some information I wanted her to share with you, including a poem of the Elder Justice Unit, because our main jobs are that my unit doesn't have any investigatory responsibilities. I use my past experience to help guide people to what services would be most helpful to them today. So my unit is basically almost like I call ourselves navigators. When people call us, they really don't, they know they're experiencing an abusive situation, but they're not sure based on the scenario, which is the best authority to investigate. Because in Ohio, we kind of have a fragmented elder justice system. There's a lot of different organizations. So our jobs is really to help get that family to where they need to go, either with the resources in my office or the resources across Ohio.
Thank you, Sylvia, thank you so much.